This message comes from eBay. The worst part about loving cars might just be buying them and all the parts. From Toyotas to Aston Martins, eBay has thousands of cars and the largest online selection of vehicle parts and accessories. eBay, things people love.
What's good, y'all? You are listening to Code Switch, the show about race and identity from NPR. I'm Gene Demby.
And I'm B.A. Parker.
Parker, a little birdie told me that used to be a brownie growing up in Baltimore. Is that true?
To be fair, it was only for like 2 weeks, which is very anticlimactic.
That counts.
But I don't know. But I maintained my access to the Do-si-dos and Thin Mints.
You got the Do-si-do plug. You got the, okay. Wait, so why were you you only there for 2 weeks? What happened?
I feel like I was too young, and probably because most of it was just sitting around telling ghost stories.
I feel like also that would be kind of your bag, though. I feel like you would love that.
Man,
grown
they were
Parker
too scary for me. But were you a Boy Scout?
I was in the Cub Scouts, for the little ones. Pack 433. Shout out to Miss Ann and Miss Anita, Miss Doris at St. Charles in South Philly. Yeah, so every Saturday morning we would go, do arts and crafts, little projects, learn some fun skill that I never used again. But I remember we used to go camping every summer. This campground outside of Philly somewhere. It was fun. We row some boats and It was fun. It's funny because I haven't thought about scouting for years, at least, until this month.
Why? What happened?
Well, your boy, Pete Hegseth.
My boy.
Yeah, your boy, Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, really got a bee in his bonnet about the Boy Scouts. Well, now known as Scouting America.
Boy Scout training focused on responsible citizenship, character and leadership development, patriotism, personal fitness, self-reliance, faith, and a wide range of outdoor skills.
Okay, Gene, so what's the problem?
Okay, Parker, wait for it.
After 2012, however, the Boy Scouts lost their way, and a once great organization became gravely wounded. Diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, crept in. The name was changed to Scouting America. Girls were accepted.
Ah, there it is.
Yeah, there it is. He said the focus on God was being watered down, that it was embracing paganism, and he said the organization had stopped focusing specifically on boys.
They even welcomed the destructive myth of gender fluidity and transgenderism to infiltrate their membership. Along the way, standards were lowered and merit destroyed in favor of an insidious, radical, woke ideology that is anti-America and anti-American.
This is a lot of passion to stop girls from whittling. So Pete Hegseth has spent much of his public-facing career railing against diversity.
Yeah, since he became Secretary of Defense, he's tried to get rid of DEI in the military.
No more identity months, DEI offices, dudes in dresses. No more climate change worship. No more division, distraction, or gender delusions. No more debris. As I've said before, and will say again, we are done with that.
Yeah.
And now he's turning his anti-woke attentions to the Scouts.
Yeah. Just a side note, Parker. Hegseth posted this video talking about the Scouts to his social media accounts less than 1 day before the U.S. started a war with Iran.
Time and place, Hegseth.
But yeah, Hegseth said, that the number of Scouts in the United States dropped from 10 million in 1970 to around 1 million today.
And he blamed that drop in membership on DEI?
Yes, he told Scouting America that they had to comply with the Trump administration's anti-DEI executive orders, or the Defense Department was going to stop supporting the organization.
This department had a close relationship with the Scouts almost since its inception, as many troops meet on military bases.
He said that they can't have transgender kids in the organization and that everyone who joined had to use their sex as assigned at birth. He made them get rid of a merit badge about citizenship. And he said that they had to waive any membership fees for people associated with the military. And he gave the Scouts 6 months to comply, or else.
We have a department to protect, after all.
Parker, apparently these issues have been dogging the world of scouting long before Pete Hegseth was banging on the table about, whether little kids getting their merit badges for tying knots was really some affirmative action plot. These are issues that have been with scouting almost since the beginning. And that is what we're going to get into today. Like how these questions and controversies over race and gender have shaped the world of scouting back in the day and now.
Take it away, Gene.
Support for NPR and the following message come from Homeserve. It never happens at a good time. The pipe bursts at midnight. The heater quits on the coldest night. Good thing Homeserve's hotline is available 24/7. Call to schedule a repair and a local pro will be on their way. Trusted by millions. For plans starting at $4.99 a month, go to homeserve.com. Not available everywhere. Most plans range between $4.99 to $11.99 a month your first year. Terms apply on covered repairs.
Benjamin René Jordan is a historian, and we hollered at him while he was on sabbatical doing scouty things in the mountains, taking in all that nature. We could see all these pretty trees behind him when we got him on Zoom.
Well, I'm actually right now in the Salt Lake City area. So just yesterday I was, hiking the Mormon Temple Quarry Trail.
But Ben is not a scout, although he is something of a scholar of the Scouts.
I'm a historian of American gender and environmental and cultural and social history.
Ben wrote a book called Modern Manhood and the Boy Scouts of America, Citizenship, Race, and the Environment, 1910 to 1930. He's working on another book about the role scouting organizations played in the early civil rights movement and in environmental activism. So obviously, Ben is the dude we had to talk to try and make sense of Pete Hegseth's beef with the Scouts. And Ben told me that to get why Pete Hegseth is so hot about the Scouts, like, you gotta understand that in its heyday, scouting was huge. It was one of the largest voluntary organizations in American history, with more than 5 million Americans involved in some kind of scouting between 1910 and 1930. And during that time, publishers said that the Scout Handbook was the highest selling English language book of all time, after the Bible.
Yes, I think this is true.
That is
because
bananas.
it was a worldwide organization. The American was just one chapter, one division of it. So huge, and now just one thing amongst many types of alternatives. But back then it was the alternative, or not the alternative. It was the game, especially for a lot of small town or mid-sized town kids. It was a big thing back in the teens to 20s through about the 60s, when they started running into some kind of membership problems and, making some changes and stuff.
Right. I mean, the Scouts were supported by everybody from the Rockefellers and the Roosevelts to famous socialists like Eugene Debs. So you mentioned how big scouting became. How did it become such a huge part of American youth culture?
It was at a time where American society was really changing, modernizing, urbanizing. This is the 1910s. This is World War I. This is cars and movies and kind of electric lights and a much more radio, fairly soon radio. So kind of a very much a modernizing society. And a lot of people felt like something's being lost in traditional society particularly in terms of teaching what became popular called adolescence. It didn't exist before 1900. The modern notion of adolescence didn't really exist. It was just you're either kind of a child or you're, basically a young adult at 13 or 14 and you're already working. And so scouting came along in part to fill a perceived need in experiential skill training, getting outside of the family and church world school world and church world into, I was often part of a church. So scout troops were often related to churches, not always, but half of them were. So it wasn't necessarily a digression from church, but it was a complement to the home and a complement to the school in teaching kind of real life, quote, real life skills. But also very much, and this is what made the early scouting and Girl Scouting so popular, was not only being outdoors, campy, hikey kind of stuff, but they did a lot with their communities, community activism, community uplift, really some kind of early forms of civil rights activism, as well as environmental conservation. But they worked a lot with being out and not hiding the kids away, as the schools tended to do, but instead engaging them with their cities, with their communities in a public responsibility kind of way.
A couple of weeks ago, Pete Hegseth, Secretary of Defense, posted this video on his social accounts criticizing Scouting America. He said that the organization had become, quote, gravely wounded. He said it was in large part because of diversity, equity, inclusion creeping in and changing the organization. And since you wrote a book about this history and how the organization has thought about race and gender in the past, I'm curious about what you thought about. Firstly, I'm curious about what you thought about Hegseth's critique of Scouting, of the Boy Scouts or Scouting America.
Yes. Well, I think it was historically inaccurate. It was fake news, if you want to use kind of a modern day parlance. The way that Hegseth described Scouting's history and traditions, it seemed like he was saying, "I'm trying to return this to traditional, good old fashioned Scouting," and he's wrong in a number of ways. He should have read my book, and then he would know what was going on. What is tradition? What is history to Scouting? And other people's books too. They were ironically in the teens and 20s and 30s quite, quote, liberal, progressive, and, if you want to call it in modern day parlance, DEI oriented, including people that had been marginalized in society, African Americans, Jewish people, Catholic people, immigrants. The Scouts were very proactive in the 19 and 20s and 30s, which is a lot of what my book is about, on including those people, making them welcome, bringing them in on their own terms. They weren't as open as they are now on the gender front, but in terms of race and ethnicity and religion, they were liberal, progressive, and DEI in the 19 teens and 20s more so than a lot of American institutions, especially national ones.
Right. Is the fact that by the 60s, when you said when you start to see these membership declines, that American society is pretty thoroughly urbanized at that point, right? Is that why you see the membership declines? Is obviously Pete Hegseth thinks this is a cultural stuff, but it sounds like what you're saying is it filled this sort of need to have some kind of bridge between the urbanizing, modernizing world and what came before. But by the 60s, maybe that imperative is weaker.
Yeah, I would say that's part of it. There was no longer that kind of strong need for that by the time we get to the 60s. Also, of course, in the 1960s, you have a lot of a shift towards more of a youth counterculture, youth, quote, rebellion, doubting traditional traditions and authority. And Scouting became one of the kind of targets of that doubting of authority. This is early anti-war activism, environmental activism, which the Scouts were always good about in the environment. So that wasn't their weak flank. It was more they were seen as part of the establishment in some ways. And so a lot of young people were doing other things besides Scouting. By the time we get to the late 60s, early 70s,
right.
Membership declines. They went, it's an interesting history in and of itself. They went and doubled down on being more urban and more, in some ways, DEI, if you would call it that, in the 70s. The Scouts did. That didn't work. They continued to lose numbers. And in the 80s, 1980s, kind of with the Ronald Reagan era, Republican kind of era, that's when they switched to being, quote, back to, quote, traditional. But what came in the 1980s was not really that similar to what came before. They kind of became a different beast and became more narrower, less welcoming, less accepting in the 80s than they had been the previous 70 years, to be honest.
So it's funny to me because my understanding of it was that, and I could be completely wrong here, was that the Girl Scouts were the more, I don't want to use the word woke, but the more, socially progressive organization. They were more accepting of people with different gender identities. And I always assumed that the Boy Scouts were less so. I mean, they, as recently as 2000, they sued all the way to the Supreme Court to keep gay troop leaders from joining the organization. And they said that forcing them to include gay leaders was a violation of their First Amendment rights. So, this idea that I had that the Boy Scouts were less historically inclusive than the Girl Scouts, you're saying that's not the case at all.
Mm-hmm. That's more of an 80s, 90s things for the Boy Scouts. Now, certainly props to the Girl Scouts for being more accepting and open of trans members earlier than the Boy Scouts. I think their official announcement actually was 2011 when they're like, oh, yeah, we've been accepting trans girls. But in the early decades, Boy Scouting was more inclusive in terms of race, religion, ethnicity, much more proactive than the Girl Scouts were for about 30, 40 years. So that's a lot of what my book is about, is correcting a misunderstanding and misassumption from present day society.
That's really
That the
interesting.
Girl Scouts were the ones, I mean, not that I'm trying to undercut or criticize the Girl Scouts, but they weren't that active as the Boy Scouts were. The Boy Scouts were the cutting leading edge in youth organizations for including, again, Jewish, Catholic, African American, Asian American, Mexican American, Italian American, people of different religions and faiths. They were big and strong on that nearly from the get-go. Whereas the Girl Scouts lagged behind that until really the 1940s or 50s, I would say. They were pretty white and pretty WASP. I mean, not exclusively, but pretty much.
That's really interesting. So, but why would that have been? Like, the period you're talking about is the period of like, you're talking about the 19-teens and the 20s. Like, this is the era of like, spectacle lynchings and Jim Crow and like, and the Klan is actively opposed to Catholics and immigrants. This sort of contempt for these people was a mainstream position, right? Like, why was the Boy Scouts of America sort of a outlier in like mainstream organizations, even as it doesn't embrace these people? Like, how did that come to be?
I think the Boy Scouts originally saw in its leaders, and most, many, not all of its members, there were some leaders who wouldn't allow African American Scouts, wouldn't allow Japanese American Scouts, didn't really want the Catholics in their troop or whatever. So there were certainly some local troop leaders and sponsoring organizations, troop sponsoring organizations, who were, discriminatory. But overall, the organization was very broad and inclusive and encouraged and pushed their members and their troops and their sponsoring organizations and their, regional office leaders and paid local office leaders, pushed them to be more inclusive because they saw it as this changing, modernizing, diversifying society. We need to give all boys the same training and character and citizenship and patriotism and responsibility and work ethic through the outdoors and through community engagement. So they saw themselves as being patriotic and in their terms. And that's why the word nonpartisan, which the Boy Scouts kind of threw out about, we work with the Democrats and Republicans back in the teens and 20s and 30s. What was meant by the term nonpartisan was it was nonpartisan to accept African Americans. It was nonpartisan to accept Jews and encourage Catholics to join. Partisan would have been the Ku Klux Klan, who wanted to exclude or marginalize Catholics, Jews, immigrants, and African Americans and other people of color. But the Boy Scouts were very much on the other side of that. In fact, they even got into public debates with the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan told them, hey, we're going to cut funding. We're going to pull our boys out if you don't kick out the Catholics, the Jews, and the Black Americans. And the Boy Scouts told them to shove it. So they said, the Klan, you guys aren't patriotic. This is not our vision of what nationalism or patriotism should be. We are inclusive. If you don't like that, you can take your donation check that you threaten to withhold, and you can take your members, your boys, and stay out because we aren't you. We aren't the Klan. So they were like quite literally having public debates with the Ku Klux Klan about membership and DEI in the 1920s.
When we come back,
what has been accomplished is making sure girls and trans and gay people feel like they should have the opportunity to serve the military and serve the country. Oh, the delicious irony.
That's coming up. Stay with us, y'all. You're listening to Code Switch from NPR.
This message comes from Midi Health, a virtual care platform for women in perimenopause and menopause. Chief Medical Officer Dr. Kathleen Jordan shares the wide range of symptoms they work to address for women in midlife.
There's dry eyes, dry hair, dry skin, there's dry mouth, trouble sleeping, panic and anxiety attacks. When we ask patients about common symptoms, on average, they report 6.
Midi Health, committed to helping women in midlife with perimenopause and menopause care, accessible via telehealth visits. at joinmidi.com.
Gene, Code Switch. We've been chopping it up with Benjamin René Jordan, who wrote a book about the history of the Boy Scouts in America. Okay, so the U.S. Department of Defense, or the Department of War, as they call themselves these days, has a lot going on right now. Like, we are in the beginnings of a war with Iran. We have military entanglements in Venezuela, in Ecuador, and Cuba, maybe on the horizon. But in the midst of all that, Pete Hegseth, who is the Secretary of Defense, found time to put Scouting America, formerly known as the Boy Scouts, on notice. His words. He says the Boy Scouts have been pushing DEI as part of an anti-American woke agenda. So here are some of the demands that Pete Hegseth gave the Scouts. Okay, first, he wanted them to get rid of one of the merit badges for citizenship in society, specifically the one that had been established in 2020 after the murder of George Floyd. He also wanted them to adopt a merit badge for military service, more on that in a second. And he wanted them to waive the membership fees for any scout who was in a family with somebody in the military. So I wanted to ask Ben about these new changes, but also about this sometimes complicated relationship between the Scouts and the U.S. military. When I was a kid and I was a scout, I'm really young, so like grains of salt, I was a child.
Yep.
Like I was like 7 or 8 years old. But just in my, elementary school brain, the sort of having a rank and moving up with badges, that felt very much like, oh, the Army. This is the Army. That was like what I understood it to be. But you said that there's been this like complicated relationship between militarism and scouting for a long time. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Yes, there's this kind of idea of ranks. Yes, there are these kind of, what does that look like? A military reserve uniform for the Boy Scout? What is that?
Yeah, right.
But it also looks like a park ranger outfit. It's closer
Yes,
to
that's
that.
true.
Or some, whatever, public service, whatever kind of community service, first aid responder kind of, practically. So in essence, having a military service badge, there's a reason why it would be a new badge, is because they've never had one.
Can you say more about that? Like
Yeah.
that sort of, the origins of that?
Yes. So in essence, at the time, Boy Scouting, as actually, you may know, was British in origin, and a big British military leader, Sir General Robert Baden-Powell, created Boy Scouting, copying actually some Native American and frontier Western pioneer organizations that had been developed in America. Baden-Powell took that idea, kind of cheated and copied some things, and created kind of more of a slightly more military looking thing. And in other nations, Great Britain and the British Empire, it had more of a military tone, and it tended to be more military leaders. There are some military leaders of Boy Scouts of America troops now and in the past, true. Sometimes American Legion was a big troop sponsor for a number of years, for example. Military bases, there is scouting on military bases with military-based kid troops, in the troop. But it wasn't primarily a military organization. When the United States, what ended up happening is there were several competing Boy Scout versions of Boy Scouting, because it was a British idea. Quickly, some people copied it in America, but they took different versions of it. One was like a pacifist scouting, or it was called like the California Peace Scouts or whatever. So they were like hardcore, like anti-war, right? There was
California.
Yeah. In California, the Peace Scouts or California Peace Scouts or something kind of came and went kind of quickly. A more military organization called the American Boy Scouts.
The American Boy
And they
Scouts.
changed their name later to the Boy Scouts of the United States. And then when the Boy Scouts of America sued them for making the Boy Scouts of America look like they might be a military organization by proximity to the scouting name, legally sued them to change their name. They changed their name to the American Junior Cadets.
And so cadets is in the title. So
Yes.
then it sounds much more explicitly
Yes.
about military, like
but
the Army.
that organization, nobody, unless you're a specialist in youth organization history, has ever heard of today. That was the military version. They weren't popular. They were too partisan. They were too militaristic, and especially in the 19-teens and before we actually got involved in World War I. This is early 19-teens. This is kind of more of a peaceful, let's be cooperative with each other, let's not go to war, let's find other ways to solve our problems kind of era. So particularly in that, until the United States got into the war, and again, the Scouts definitely supported the war effort on a civilian basis. So they would collect rubber and collect metal and tin and aluminum and sell war bonds. So the Boy Scouts definitely, supported the war effort once the country got into war in World War I and World War II. But overall, they were explicitly civilian and explicitly not military. So they didn't want to be associated directly with the military. So they never had a military badge, and they didn't allow they didn't give all their kids guns, which the American Boy Scouts did.
The American Boy Scouts
gave their kids guns.
Giving kids guns.
Yeah, and one thing to do rifle practice at camp, because the Boy Scouts did do that, the Boy Scouts of America, but they were like marching around with guns. And early in the 19-teens, one of the trouble spots was literally one of the boys shot and killed another kid. These are, teens, people in their teens, because of some kind of argument or a snowball fight or something kind of wacky. This is like early 19-teens, and the Boy Scouts of America is like, we don't want any part of that. So they specifically said, we're not a military organization. We are a civilian character, citizenship, patriotic organization. We're not teaching our kids, military, whatever. And that was the version of scouting that became popular, not the pacifist version, not the extreme military junior ROTC version. It was the civilian character, environment, conservation, community service, civil rights, broad, inclusive DEI version. That's the version of scouting that became popular. That's why they got a federal charter in 1916, the second ever in the country after the Red Cross and before the American Legion.
What does it mean to have a federal charter from Congress? Like, what comes with that?
In essence, for the Scouts, it meant you got somewhat kind of preferred treatment compared to the other youth, in this case, compared to the other youth organizations. So some of those things that like Hegseth was threatening to withdraw, and the military was only one component of that. 90% of it came from outside of the military. So it was like being able to camp on national and state park land, national and state forest land, hiking, training from rangers, from federal or state employed government rangers who would do conservation work with them. It was, kind of access to public lands in a kind of preferred treatment kind of way. Hey, we're not going to charge you, and you can build a Boy Scout camp in this national forest.
Right.
But part of what it made them popular was they weren't explicitly affiliated, the Boy Scouts weren't, in the 19-teens, with either the Democrats or the Republicans or the Socialists, but they were kind of friendly and open to all of them. They worked with all of them. They tried to recruit support from the left labor unions, and Eugene Debs and the Socialists they were communicating directly with and trying to get them to say, hey, what about a socialist Boy Scout troop? They were, what about a labor union, AFL, American Federation of Labor, scout troop and leaders? And we'll give you special training. We'll help you make it happen.
So Pete Hegseth is describing the current iteration of Scouting America as deeply controversial. They got their gender inclusivity, their DEI policies, their move away from very Christian-centered language. But, how much of this stuff is controversial within the actual organization itself?
Yeah. I would say it I'm sure it must be controversial. I'd love to hear more. We almost get a little bit, as far as what I've been able to get a hold of and read, kind of a little bit of a, just these kind of statements being issued by the national office rather than getting the play-by-play of the discussions and debates they've had about it. It seemed like they were definitive about, we are not going to start excluding girls, gay members, or trans members. We are not going to do that. That was like point blank. And I think a lot of the organizations, troop sponsoring organizations, whether they're churches or American Legions or Sierra Clubs or, schools, there's some schools and private schools that sponsor scout troops. Those people who I think were going to leave because of allowing gay, trans, and girl members, they've already left. The Mormons have left, certain conservative groups. There's splinter scouting organizations now that are more conservative in nature. So they've already left. So it probably is less controversial than if this stuff hit 5 years ago or 10 years ago. because the damage has already been done to the membership. So what you have left is the people who are in on the quote DEI / more inclusive membership.
Or at least like for people for whom those are not deal breakers. At least.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Troop by troop, the Boy Scouts allow them to exclude girls. Troop by I think it's still the case. Troop by troop, they can decide a little bit more their membership policies or how exactly they teach, or the way that they interpret the Scout Oath and laws. It still varies quite a bit. So there may be some very conservative groups still in Boy Scouting officially, but it's not enough of a deal breaker because they did leave already.
I promise I'm not asking you to be like a moderator and get into the psyche of Pete Hegseth. But
okay, yeah.
Why is Scouting America such a useful target for the Secretary of Defense? Like, why would Pete Hegseth put Scouting America on notice as opposed to, you know what I mean, just trying to promote one of the conservative scouting organizations that exist now that's more aligned with his beliefs?
These other organizations are not that popular. These other kind of little small, they may be gaining a number, but hey, we're talking about 30,000 people, not a million plus. So
right.
it's not big news to say, why doesn't everybody join? He could say, and those people have that choice. Go join that other organization that's not the specifically Latter-day Saints one, but is the traditional scouting, whatever they call themselves. I forget what the names of them are. So he could have promoted those, but it's not useful in terms of, like you're saying, finding a national controversial topic. So that's probably why it's useful instead of, hey, let's promote this obscure scouting organization that will never become that big.
Right. What does watching Pete Hegseth put the Scouts, on notice tell you about where the country is culturally and politically?
Well, it's interesting because I would say, well, one, we have people in key federal government positions that are partisan. That's almost a requirement to be a Trump-appointed, lead official in the federal government, is to not take that neutral stance that, not to be too Republican or too Democrat. That used to be like seen as a positive thing, kind of being nonpartisan because I'm the Department of Defense head. I'm the Secretary of the Interior. I should be kind of nonpartisan, even if I'm appointed by someone from the Republican or Democratic Party or whatever. But now we have kind of a different style of federal government where nonpartisanship is no longer, it's a negative in Trump world. So that's one thing that this controversy makes me think about. Two is, it seems to have very little to do with the Department of Defense. I mean, sure, it's use of a little military land, but most of the public land that the Scouts use, most of the benefits they get from state and federal government have nothing to do with the military. So it seems like an overreach that I don't even think the Boy Scouts should be that worried about, because it's like, okay, we got to hold our jamboree somewhere else. It's called Philmont, right? Okay, yeah, we're going to need a truckload of volunteers or busloads of volunteers to give us what we were getting, but who needs it if we've got to be these partisan lackeys that are going to try to pressure us about our membership? We went down a road as an organization, and we're going to commit to it these last 10, 15 years of a more open Boy Scout or Scouting America membership. I also think that Hegseth and all this controversy makes me think Hegseth, in a way, lost, and Scouting America and DEI won.
How so?
In essence, because they refused absolutely to cave on allowing girls into Scouting America, allowing trans and allowing gay members and leaders. Thus, and they're not like they're kicking out everybody, people of color. They're not just all of a sudden throwing them all out either. So in essence, they are doing the DEI thing. They just had to give a badge that said, we should think about these things as a merit badge. They had to give up their DEI committee, but you know what? Their DEI committee worked because they're now open to every youth there is. And there's some people who disagree with that. Nonetheless, they are a frontline DEI organization. They just don't get to offer that merit badge anymore. And now they're going to offer a military service badge to trans, gay, and female members, which is the grand irony in that what has been accomplished is making sure the girls and trans and gay people feel like they should have the opportunity to serve the military and serve the country. Oh, the delicious irony. Like if they could take that back, wouldn't they take that back? Like, oh man, we just screwed that up. Look at what we just did. And they required it. And to be equal, probably it's going to be required to be equal. I don't know if it will be or not, for girls to learn military service.
Ben Jordan is a historian of gender and early 20th century youth organizations. Thank you so much, Ben. Appreciate you.
Thanks so much, Gene.
And that is our show, y'all. You can follow us on Instagram at NPR Code Switch. That's all one word. If email is more your thing, ours is codeswitch@npr.org. And subscribe to the podcast on the NPR app or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also subscribe to the Code Switch newsletter by going to npr.org/Code Switch newsletter. And just a reminder that signing up for Code Switch Plus is a great way to support our show, a great way to support public media, which you might have heard needs all the help it can get. And you get to listen to every episode of our show and a bunch of other NPR favorites sponsor free. So please go find out more at plus.npr.org/Code Switch. This episode you're listening to was produced by Christina Kalla. It was edited by Leah Donnella. Our engineer was Jimmy Keeley. And we'd be remiss if we did not shout out the rest of the Code Switch massive. That's Xavier Lopez, Jess Kung, Dalia Mortada, Yolanda Sangweni, B.A. Parker, and me. I'm Gene Demby. Be easy, y'all.
This message comes from Mint Mobile. If you're tired of spending hundreds on big wireless bills, bogus fees, and free perks, Mint Mobile might be right for you with plans starting from $15 a month. Shop plans today at mintmobile.com/switch. Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month 5GB plan required. New customer offer for first 3 months only. Then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See Mint Mobile for details. This message comes from Warby Parker. Prescription eyewear that's expertly crafted and unexpectedly affordable. Glasses designed in-house from premium materials starting at just $95, including prescription lenses. Stop by a Warby Parker store near you.
This message comes from NPR sponsor 1Password. Anyone else feel like 99% of your emails and texts are password reset codes? Trusted by millions of users and over 175,000 businesses, 1Password lets you skip the resets and sign in securely with strong, unique passwords that autofill across all your devices. You can safely share logins, store cards and files, and finally stop using your pet's name as a password. Try it free for 2 weeks at onepassword.com/NPR.